Hello, I'm Malcolm Sender. I have the honour of being the chairman of the Leeds Jewish Historical Society, which actually is a branch of the Jewish Historical Society of England, which is based in London. This speaker is Ellery Weil from Washington, D.C. She has been doing research on American women's or Jewish organizations from 1850 to 1900. She is finishing her PhD in England at the Hebrew Department of University College London. It was always expected that the origin of Jewish women's organisation was through Zionism, but this is not the fact. The organisations, which are well known like Hadassah and Witzo, were formed after 1900. In fact, the period she is investigating is Jewish social work, which in many ways mimics the Christian rich ladies of New York who helped the poor. Many of them were very rich, but not all of them. And in fact, they pushed the organizations of women's organizations in America and the Netherlands. In many ways, these were the precursors of the suffragette movement.
This is your Leeds Jewish station, Radio JCOM. Radio JCOM.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Hello, my name is Ellery. As I was kindly mentioned, I'm a current doctoral candidate at University of London, studying the origins of the Jewish women's movement at the end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century, which is what I'm here to address you on. And our story begins. The year is 1893, the year that Leeds was granted city status, but the setting is Chicago. The 1893 World's Fair was known as the Columbian Exposition. It was set to mark 400 years since the voyage of Columbus, which was in 1492. They were a year late getting the fair together. Chicago had bid fearsomely to host the fair. They were rivals with New York. There were feuds in the papers. The Chicagoans called New Yorkers hogs, vultures, and not proper Americans. And apparently this sort of talk worked, because they did win the bid to host the fair. Bold of them to try, as they had burnt to the ground in 1871 in the Great Chicago Fire, but they had rebuilt, and they viewed the fair as the chance to show the world not just the splendor of the United States, but the splendor of Chicago. And among other exhibitions, the Chicago Fair was desperate to outdo the previous Paris World's Fair, where the Eiffel Tower had been unveiled. From the moment the fair was announced, it was internationally relevant. Papers in Europe, even Asia, were discussing it. But there were two exhibitions at the 1893 World's Fair that were particularly unusual and unprecedented. One was the Women's Building, and the other was the Parliament of Religions. The Women's Building was the first World's Fair exhibition dedicated purely to the work of women, showcased fine arts, although not domestic arts, inventions, manufacturing. The building itself was designed exclusively by female architects, and the heads of the Board of Lady Managers, whose brainchild this was, were the two most socially prominent women in Chicago, Bertha Honora Palmer and Ellen Henderson. Bertha Palmer, the name might ring a bell if you've ever heard of the Palmer House Hotel, a very fine hotel in Chicago. That was her husband's wedding present to her. The Parliament of Religions was the brainchild of a Methodist minister who worried that the fair's emphasis on progress was too worldly, was edging towards the concept of greed. And he wanted there to be a spiritual dimension to the fair, the idea that progress could be spiritual and moral as well as simply material. And from the beginning, the Parliament of Religions was unusual because in America, religion had often stood for any type of Protestant you care to be, but the Parliament of Religions made a point of including all faiths, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. The opening address to the Parliament of Religions was given by a Hindu mystic to give you an idea of the international tone that they set. And there was not one, but two Jewish elements to the Parliament of Religions. Here we have a picture. You can see it's a very international crowd here. You can also note difficult to make out here, but there are some ladies in their fantastic 1890s hats in the audience. This was always a wonderfully diverse crowd. Hannah Greenbaum Solomon was the matriarch, in every sense of the word, of the Jewish Women's Congress at the Chicago World's Fair. Her family was one of the oldest Jewish families in Chicago. When they first moved to the city, there were 5 Jews listed in the Chicago phone directory. She was also a close personal friend of Ellen Henderson and socially acquainted with Bertha Palmer. She and her sister were the first Jews ever allowed in the Chicago Women's Club. She also, irrelevant, but to give you an idea of where she was on the American social stratum, when she had traveled to Washington in the 1880s, she was introduced to Grover Cleveland in a purely social sense. Just popped by the White House, had some tea, met Grover Cleveland, as one does. So she was an obvious choice to lead a Jewish women's exhibition, because if anyone knew the right people and had the right name for such a thing, it was her. She was Reform, but considered herself a staunchly observant Jew. Her family practiced traditionally, enough so that they used a Shabbos Goy. Solomon herself was staunchly Reform. There was a lot of controversy around the fact that she kept a Sunday Sabbath, which would be a controversial aspect of her life for as long as she lived. She would occasionally be very caustic about it, because she gave interviews about the Sunday services that she attended, and she said, oh, yes, anyone complaining it was Christian, obviously you come in here and it's full of Christmas trees and we're all singing hymns to Jesus. Oh, wait, no, this is a synagogue service. She had a biting sense of humor when they needed a Jewish woman to contribute. So Hannah Solomon was vehement about this going into the Parliament of Religions, even though Palmer and Henderson, when they approached her, most likely intended for her to place this in the women's building. There's a reason for that, and that is that Hannah Solomon, like many Jewish women of her time, vehemently rejected the racialization of Judaism. She had this idea that if we put this in the women's building next to the African American women's exhibition and the Asian women's exhibition, Judaism will have a racial connotation. I want it in the Parliament of Religions because Judaism should have a purely spiritual connotation. She had a huge, prolonged battle with the Jewish men's organization, who said, oh, can't you just put this event in with our Jewish men's event? To which she said, okay, where can I fit the women speakers into your existing program? After a few moments of silence, she said, that's what I thought. We're having a separate women's event. So she immediately began exchanging letters with Nettie Franklin. She claims that the two of them exchanged over 3,000 letters in the course of planning. Solomon was known to exaggerate, so it may not have been quite 3,000. But this was before she had ever actually been to Europe, but she was in correspondence with several English Jewish women through various Jewish organizations. She'd been passed along addresses. She credited Nettie Franklin as a co-organizer of the Congress, though unfortunately she couldn't make it. Speakers at the conference heavily pressed this idea of an international movement. The Anglo-Jewish Association was mentioned, as was the AIU, as the term they used was actually missionary organizations. At the time, a lot of Christian language was adopted around Jewish activities, seemingly so that any onlooking Gentiles understood what they were talking about. But yes, the AJA and the AIU were described as vital missionary organizations. Missionary work in the Jewish context of the 1890s was used to refer not to intrafaith outreach. It was this idea that a Jewish missionary obviously would not proselytize to Gentiles, but would attempt to educate, enlighten, and improve the conditions of their fellow Jews. And here we have some speakers. Solomon and her co-organizer, Sadie American, determined what subjects they would like addressed, and then wrote to intellectually prominent Jewish women across America saying, would you be interested in speaking on these topics or any other topic that strikes your fancy? For the most part, the speakers did stick to the prescribed topics. One of the most famous would be Rachel Ray Frank. She was never actually ordained, but she was known as the Girl Rabbi of the Golden West, made her living in Washington State and Oregon, working as a kind of traveling, not rabbi, but yes, rabbi. She also did take rabbinical courses at Hebrew Union College, but left before her ordination could occur, although the famous Reform Rabbi, Rabbi Wise, did want to ordain her. She spoke about the role of women in Judaism, and she soft-pedaled her message. She described the role of women as high priestesses in the home, and she would say things like, obviously women are fully capable of being rabbis, but there are other roles. Within the context of someone as famous as her, this would be understood to be the example that I've given is it's as if Oprah were standing up saying, I mean, you could have a talk show. You don't have to, but you could. So the fact that she spoke was in itself quite remarkable. Julia Richmond. Julia Richmond was the first female superintendent of schools for the city of New York, let alone first Jew. There is a school named after her in New York to this day. And her speech was probably one of the fieriest and most controversial. Hers was about economic independence for women, both Jewish and Gentile, but particularly immigrants. And one of the points that she most drove home was that women needed economic independence so that they would not be forced to enter arranged marriages. Unlike many of the others, she practiced what she preached. She never married. She worked all of her life. But she was diverging from a lot of the popular talking points about female employment, which had mainly focused on high-achieving women, authors, women wanting to go into law, whereas she spoke about the dignity of lower-level work, even the much maligned factory work, as preferable because of the aspect of independence to entering a marriage out of economic necessity. Minnie Lewis, another educator, she would be credited later as one of the founding members of the National Council for Jewish Women. She was quite close with Hannah Solomon, and her paper went back to this concept of missionary work among the unenlightened Jews. And she praised the work of the AJA and AIU as these fine missionary organizations. The AJA's work in England, the AIU's work in French North Africa. Her speech would be quite startling in the present day because it was fairly nakedly imperialist, but that was what missionary work meant, certainly among those unenlightened Jews. And Sadie American, social worker, educator, immigrant advocate, she would publish several pieces on the need for urban spaces to be friendly to children, the importance of playgrounds, a book called The Immigrant Child about how to educate the children of immigrants. She and Julia Richmond were the first to travel abroad on behalf of the National Council for Jewish Women, which this very Congress would spawn. And her piece, Organization, was the longest, would lead to the forming of the National Council for Jewish Women, and was very much the final crescendo to every speech that had come before it. She gave this speech about how, we've heard these previous speeches about faith and the home and immigrants and education and history. Many of the speakers appealed to history, including a pair of speeches contrasting Jewish women in the Middle Ages with modern Jewish women. And now we must band together to organize, to fight for our collective self as Jewish women. So the end result would be the founding of the National Council for all of Jewish Women. And the Jewish Women's Congress is, when it's very infrequently mentioned in the history books, mostly in the context of the thing that spawned the National Council for Jewish Women, which incidentally still exists to this day, as does its sister organization, the International Council for Jewish Women, which would come into being in the 1920s and is currently headquartered in Sydney, Australia. I believe we were already at the most famous aftermath and legacy of the Congress, the founding of the National Council for Jewish Women. I did foreshadow that the Congress would leave a longer shadow than that. So, be covered in over 20 newspapers, both Jewish and secular, in the US, Britain, Germany. was not covered in the Polish Jewish papers, but the Congress and the movement that it spawned became so notorious and celebrated in Jewish circles that in Israelita, the most prominent Polish Jewish paper at the time, there would be scathing references to those women from Chicago in contrast to the virtue of the Polish Jewish women. Oh, we have a soup kitchen, not a council like those women from Chicago. In Britain, the Jewish Chronicle covered the Congress and its aftermath in excruciating detail, including when the Congress published the speeches given into a bound volume. One of its chief sources of advertisement was through the British Jewish Chronicle. But by and large, the Congress was covered quite favorably, in contrast to the Jewish Men's Congress, also the Parliament of Religions. Possibly my favorite example of this was in the Allgemeine Zeitung Judentums in Germany. They sent several notes from Chicago columns. The Men's Congress, they covered as this disappointment. It was sluggish. Nobody seemed happy to be there. The topics were very rote and trite. Then they covered the Women's Congress, and the phrase they used was, it was as lively as the other was cheerless. So Hannah Solomon and Sadie American got their vindication for not joining forces with the Jewish men. The NCJW and its later sister organization, the ICJW, were considered the first non-philanthropic organizations of Jewish women in history. They would be followed quite soon after by organizations like Hadassah, but the NCJW was considered the founding mother, to the extent that they sent emissaries to Britain and to the rest of Europe in the form of Sadie American and Julia Richmond, who came to Britain, met with the leading British Jewish intellectuals of the time, discussed organization possibilities, discussed missionary work, went on to France and the Netherlands. Hannah Solomon would eventually make it to Europe herself, although that would be on behalf of the International Council of Women, though while she was in Britain, she did meet with these British Jewish organizations, including something called the Jewish Study Club of London, which had been corresponding with her extensively well before they ever met in person. You might ask, well, this is all very fascinating, but what of it? And what I'm attempting to argue in my thesis is that the Congress, the founding of the Council, and the alliances and relationships it forged were not just an interesting one-off in history, but the forming of a manifesto and the creation of a broad church Jewish women's movement that had room for anything from your Hannah Solomon's keeping their Reform Sunday Sabbaths to the strictly Orthodox Ray Frank, to Jewish women in Britain, to the work in the East End, even to Jewish women in Poland, despite the ladies from Chicago being a somewhat suspicious topic. And that this would extend both to Jewish identity and to identity as women. When you have Julia Richmond advocating for economic independence in the same room as Ray Frank talking about how women have value as spiritual leaders, it's hard not to see that something bigger is afoot. And this was the beginning. The end, thankfully, has yet to be seen. Thank you.
Was your talk Jewish women's movement in UK as well as America?
Well, my current research, as I am only partway through the doctorate, starts in America and goes out to the work in the UK and even beyond. This movement extended to the Netherlands and to a lesser extent Australia.
Yes.
So
you're saying that but for the hard work done in America, in Britain, it wouldn't have existed without the work that was started in America.
Well, there was definitely activism going on in Britain, but what I do believe started in America was this idea of unity. That the work going on in Britain would probably have stayed actually in two communities. Britain was unusual in that way. The women doing advocacy for a greater role of women in Judaism and the women doing work with immigrants in the East End were fairly separate groups. And this American concept of the broad church that was influenced heavily by the settlement house movement in Chicago was part of what brought them together to the extent that they were. Yes, and that actually gets into a much broader differentiation between American Jews had, certainly in the 19th century, a somewhat unique relationship with the country that they were living in, that American Jews viewed themselves as strictly American. And prior to the Second World War, there was actually an enormous schism in American Judaism about the Zionist movement, which many American Jews vehemently opposed, including Hannah Solomon, although she changed her mind as the 1930s drew to a close. But yeah, American Jews always viewed America as first and foremost their homeland. So that was a somewhat different aspect. That being said, it would be wrong to say that the British women were exclusively focused on Palestine. There was also a tremendous amount of activism on behalf of immigrant Jewish women in Britain. Things like the Jewish Society for the Protection of Women and Girls, Bertha Pappenheim's work. There was a lot for Jewish women living in Britain. There was less of this activism by sort of upper crust educated women on their own behalf, but there was definitely a lot of work on behalf of the Jewish poor and poor Jewish women in particular.
How does women's suffrage interface with Jewish women's organizations?
Thank you for asking. I was hoping someone would. So suffrage was actually an extremely controversial topic. Here in Britain, there was a Jewish League for Women's Suffrage. They marched alongside the Anglican and Catholic Leagues for Women's Suffrage. Anne Summers has written a wonderful book about this, it's called Living with Difference, about friendships between Jewish and Christian women at this time. And that said, the Jewish League for Women's Suffrage literally destroyed all evidence that they had ever existed once women got the vote. Within the Jewish community, suffrage activism was not considered reputable. At the Chicago World's Fair, there was this effort to speak nothing of the name of suffrage. And interestingly, a lot of Jewish women's activists were indifferent or opposed to it. Indifferent on the part of someone like Julia Richmond, probably the most famous Jewish woman activist who would oppose suffrage would be Emma Goldman, but that was because she felt, as an anarchist, no one should be voting. Let us not appease the state with this. So, that's actually probably getting into the 1950s were regressive in a lot of ways. And that's as much to do with the fact that the war was over and everyone was desperately trying to return to a perceived concept of normalcy that hadn't existed. And that extends to the Jewish community, obviously. To this day, unfortunately, there is a lot less about the economic emancipation. And I think that, first of all, there was a tradition of Jewish feminism in the 1950s and 60s, 60s and 70s more like, that was extremely secular. And in some ways, Jewish women's activists who did identify as traditionally religious were like, oh, we're not like them, and sort of deliberately distanced themselves. And nowadays, there's this unfortunate perception that, oh, we solved all that. There are more women than men in universities, so what do we need to talk about this? So, it's not necessarily a perception I'd agree with, but it is a perception that seems to exist. Not all of them. People like Hannah Solomon, absolutely. Sadie American, no. One woman who I unfortunately did not get the chance to mention, but who was amazing, was Hannah Solomon's personal secretary, Minnie Lowe, who was a Russian immigrant, and she and her fellow Russian immigrant women organized a charitable loan organization where they were giving interest-free loans to new immigrants. And it was this cabal of Russian Jewish immigrant women giving out loans to help people start a business. Part of the idea behind that was that a lot of people who were too proud to take traditional charity would be willing to take a loan to help get them on their feet, so they could reach more people that way. But yes, there definitely was a stronger element of wealthy and educated women, just because that's who had the time. But it was not all of them by any means. You also had Jewish women heavily involved in the labor movement in Britain and the U.S., mostly factory workers themselves who wanted to unionize. More mixed than you'd think. There were traditional Orthodox women involved in this. I mentioned Ray Frank. Today she would be recognized as traditionally Orthodox, despite being this groundbreaking female semi-rabbi. She preached for strictly traditional observance. She was very much in favor of keep the Sabbath, no, not on Sunday, Hannah Solomon, a Saturday Sabbath, and you better be eating kosher food. And so there were traditionally Orthodox women involved in all of this. That's also why a lot of the women I've mentioned, if you see the speeches they gave, they're very mild, very, oh, these are just my thoughts, and of course marriage and the home and traditional Judaism are very important. If you knew anything about their personal lives, you knew they were a lot more radical than that. But part of the reason they spoke that way was so as not to scare off more traditionally observant women. The men, they were never going to get. In the world, of course there was. Yes, it was in these circles, among the kinds of people who would be attending religious conferences at the Chicago World's Fair, it was much more of the social anti-Semitism. You wouldn't see violence or riots or anything, but you would see things like the gentlemen's agreements that Jews couldn't buy homes in certain areas. One of the reasons the Jewish free loan organizations were so successful was that it was hard for Jewish people to get a bank loan. So there was a lot of social anti-Semitism, but less overt. Again, it wasn't formal, but there were the social old boys networks, and a lot of the top universities did have Jewish quotas. So Harvard would say only 3% of our incoming class can be Jewish, even if a lot more than that of qualified applicants were coming in. When it started, while it was partially philanthropic, and also, and this is something that I'm happy to get into, but didn't have time to divert in my presentation, at the time, there was a real recognized difference between sophisticated philanthropy and charity. There was this idea, the loan societies are a good example of the so-called, they called it scientific philanthropy. That was much more of that sort of thing and was considered very unusual for women to get involved in. The philanthropy that was considered appropriate for women was much more, we're going to knit blankets for the poor and ladle out soup, and basically an extension of domestic work. Yes, it's the type of the work, the fact that it's a broad network, the fact that it was this plan to link, and also in part because of the Zionism, which was not philanthropic, it was political. Well, the changing in attitude I mentioned happened as World War II was drumming up. It had nothing to do with World War I. The woman in question, Hannah Solomon, was staunchly anti-Zionist, and World War I did not do much to change that. She was anti-Zionist for reasons of anti-nationalism. She said, I don't really believe in a nation-state as a particularly relevant body. I can't say let's form a nation-state when I think nationalism's wrong. It was mainly the Holocaust that sort of got her thinking differently. She actually ended up having a falling out with the National Council for Jewish Women over Zionism in the, I believe, 1910s. But anti-Zionist sentiment was very common among American Jews right up until the Second World War. That comes a lot later than my research, but from what I've read, most American Jews were fond of it. Although there was some controversy because we had considered putting the Jewish state somewhere else, but the Caribbean. But generally, American Jews were happy it went through. We supported the idea. Unlike a lot of European Jews, American Jews had no interest in making Aliyah until much, much later. But it was one of these wacky ideas that was tossed out. I think one of the U.S. Virgin Islands or something. The oldest currently in use synagogue in the United States is Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island. It's a beautiful place. I've been there. And they're very proud of this, and they have letters from George Washington that they show off to everyone who goes in. They are old. By American standards. By British standards, they were built last week. This was during that time. Yes. And that's part of why this broad church movement was inspired by a lot of the immigrant aid work that was being done at the time. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Settlement House movement, which came out of Chicago, was founded by a Gentile, Jane Addams, but worked primarily with Jewish immigrants. And they were very influential on a lot of the Jewish missionary work that would later be spawned. I think they might have even been influential on the Anglo-Jewish Association, just the way ideas move across the ocean.
Yes, if there are no more questions, I should like to thank you, obviously, for opening a window for me in any event. It's amazing how the meetings of the Historical Society always, as I said, open a window on a part of our heritage that we've never really thought about and have no knowledge of at all. And bearing in mind the vast population of our people in America, as I say, you've opened a window into something that we haven't appreciated. I'm sure there must be scope for the Jews in England to learn a lot more about what went on in America, because I, as I said, personally have no previous knowledge. All we know about is the problems with the Indians and the Civil War, and the position of the Jews as to what influence they played. I know later on there was this big Judge Brandeis, I think.
Louis Brandeis.
Yes, who did a tremendous amount of work. But other than that, to me, it was all complete, no knowledge whatsoever. And I'm sure there's scope for further research for us to learn from you, perhaps on a future occasion. So we do ask our audience to thank you in the usual way.
Our next speaker is Dr. Irvine Finkel of the British Museum. He took the measurements of Noah's Ark from the Bible, and with them he built a model of Noah's Ark. He tells me it's the size of a football pitch, which he will not be bringing along, but he will bring along photographs. It seems a very interesting project.